Thank you very much indeed. We'll see. It's a real honor for me to be back here in Israel to learn and indeed to represent the Metropolitan Police. So thank you very much to the organizers. I'm going to say a few words about our recent experiences in the UK and the current challenges as I personally see them. Now, unlike people in far too many countries, most UK citizens continue to go about their lives safely and largely unaffected by the impact or possibility of terrorism. But you will know that the United Kingdom, sadly, has had almost continuous experience of the horror and fear of terrorism in the last 45 years, and of course, sporadically for long before. And the threat, as we assess it to the UK and to UK interests, is real, it endures. Arguably, it is now as complex as it has ever been. We currently view that threat in a number of categories. Firstly, international terrorism, that posed in particular by AQ and AQ affiliates and inspired groups and individuals. The assessment in the UK now of the threat posed here is what we call substantial, which is actually one level below where we have been for most of the last 10 years, but of course does still mean that we regard an attack as a strong possibility. Secondly, Northern Irish-related terrorism. Now, it never, ever ceases to amaze me how little the ongoing difficulties and attacks in Northern Ireland feature in international and indeed, frankly, great British media. Despite things being very much better than they were at the height of what we call the Troubles, when you will be aware over 3,500 people were killed, the police there deal very regularly indeed with attempts at horrendous, murderous attacks, including executions with firearms, pipe bombs, other improvised devices, mortar attacks, large bombs. Almost all are aimed at the police, some at the military and the prison service. Through fantastic work, thankfully, very few in the last several years have been successful, but some have. Thirdly, like many countries, we have a threat from what we call domestic extremism, a phrase even harder to define than terrorism. Particularly in the UK from the extreme right wing, people who hate groups such as Muslims, Jews, gays, and other minorities. These are mostly individuals or very small groups, some people, considerable number with mental health problems, some quite young. And we frequently discover them as they are experimenting with explosives. Finally, of course, London and indeed the UK, we say London is probably the most diverse city on the planet, and that's a proud boast by us. That's what we are incredibly proud of, and that's why most of us want to work and live there. But inevitably, it also occasionally hosts those who support a wide range of terrorist causes focused on other countries, engaged perhaps in fundraising, facilitation, incitement, very occasionally attack planning. One example is the horrible attack we had last year when we had a visiting Indian general, an elderly gentleman. He was in the UK privately with his wife. He was walking down a central London street and his throat was cut by a group of young British Sikhs. Thankfully, he survived. They were identified. He was a fantastic witness and they are now convicted. Knowing that the UK is a highly attractive target for terrorists, we have, I believe, built some considerable expertise, and of course we've invested very heavily, the government have invested very heavily, particularly since 2005, to protect our borders, our national infrastructure, crowded places, iconic sites, to ensure we are effectively prepared should the worst happen, to identify those who do pose us a threat from within and abroad and be able to disrupt them, and where we possibly can, bring them to justice. And, as has been indicated before, perhaps the greatest challenge, to try to prevent people from becoming radicalized and attracted to violent extremism. Now, I am qualified, if at all, to talk a little about counter-terrorist policing and not the work of our intelligence agencies. But I do want to stress that a very, very important aspect of our modern UK model is that the police work very closely indeed with the security service and indeed the whole apparatus of government counter-terrorist efforts. This can be a fine balancing act, frankly, as the police in the UK have a proud history of operational independence and a constitutional position of separation from government and parliament. And as with any partnership, it's important that we can challenge each other, that differences are respected, and clarity of command and decision-making is maintained. We have different functions, powers, accountabilities. But the relationship between the police and the security service now in the UK is stronger than ever before. And I firmly believe that the effort has gone into that relationship, and indeed our wider relationships with government, under the umbrella of the UK's contest strategy, has been a fundamental pillar of keeping us safe. I'm glad to say that in the years from 2005, when you will remember our dark days of the terrible attacks on London's public transport system, to 2012, we've had no losses of innocent life from terrorist attacks in Great Britain. In every year since 2001, we have prevented at least one major terrorist attack of the same scale as those in 2005 within the UK through good intelligence work and effective joint working. Of course, the partnerships we have extend increasingly internationally, and very, very few of our investigations do not have a significant international dimension. In addition, the police work very closely with security professionals in businesses and with communities and community organisations like the Community Security Trust, which protects our Jewish communities. And it's this model of the police working closely with communities, businesses, agencies, and internationally which worked so well to keep our Olympic Games safe and to help our visitors, including, I'm proud to say, our Israeli visitors, feel very safe. Inevitably, like everybody, the threat we have faced has been changing and continues to do so, and I can perhaps illustrate that with a few examples from the last year to 18 months. Internationally, many countries have become much more dangerous for UK missions, companies and travellers. We've had a number of UK citizens kidnapped by terrorists in many countries, for example, Nigeria, Somalia and Kenya, and sadly some have lost their lives. Metropolitan police officers have been deployed to assist the local authorities in many of these cases and were indeed deployed to Algeria after the In Amenas siege and murders in which British companies were victims, British citizens were killed and many more kidnapped, of course, along with people from several nations. We continue to see threats to the UK linked to Pakistan and Afghanistan and also from Somalia, Yemen, and now, of course, from some other countries. We sometimes see UK citizens travelling to these places apparently to fight or to train. And some such people will no doubt stay, but there are many other possibilities. They may return and perhaps lead peaceful lives. They may return and start radicalising and recruiting others. They may return to wait for a signal to take some action, or they may self-organise once they have returned to an attack plan. Most recently, in common with many other European countries, we've seen a large number of people travelling to Syria, some with the best of humanitarian purposes, others travelling for so-called jihad. And some months ago, our Foreign Secretary said that Syria was the #1 destination for jihadists from the UK. It is worth remembering that the first successful attack by a British homegrown, if I can put it that way, suicide bomber was actually here in Tel Aviv in 2003. Mike's Bar, as many of you will know, was bombed by Mohammed Hanif and Omar Sharif, and 3 people were killed and 60 people were injured. And in the last year in the UK, we've had a number of networks of British Muslim men convicted of planning attacks within the UK. One group were arrested having begun to create peroxide-based devices. Others had identified targets such as military barracks and iconic sites in London. Another group travelled from the Midlands to the north of the country armed with a firearm and improvised devices with the intention of attacking a rally organised by a right-wing group. All were brought to justice before being able to harm anyone. And we've had many other people brought to justice for a variety of terrorist-related offences, including one middle-aged Muslim couple, not apparently part of any network at all, very, very heavy readers of internet extremist material who seem to be planning to bomb synagogues and Jewish premises, now in prison. So I think we can reasonably summarise these trends for the UK as seeing fewer large networks intent on spectacular large-scale attacks requiring considerable planning, fewer obviously receiving command and control from elsewhere, more self-organised or self-tasked groups, more lone actors, looser networks, more self-radicalised and or radicalised largely from the internet, and internationally, a wider range of countries from whence threat may come. AQ senior leadership and core have obviously been significantly denuded, but the brand is still powerful and pervasive, certainly within the UK, and for the UK, the threat has become more varied. Most recently in the UK, we have seen two sets of appalling events. In both cases, people have been arrested and they await trial. So in deference to our principle of sub judice, even in this audience, as they await trial, I must be very careful what I say. Firstly, you will perhaps all of you have seen the dreadful killing of Mr. Lee Rigby, an off-duty soldier brutally attacked by two men in a South London street in May this year. It was just shortly after the attacks in Boston. Two men are charged with this offence and also with crimes against police officers who attended the scene, attempted murder and firearms offences. Subsequently, in the Midlands, 3 separate IEDs containing nails were left near mosques. A Ukrainian man, recently arrived in the UK, has been charged in connection with these attacks and also with the murder of an elderly Muslim man stabbed in the street. For some in our Muslim and other communities, this has raised the spectre of the possibility of minorities being targeted by individuals travelling from countries where extreme racist attitudes are much more entrenched than they are in the UK. Both these sets of crimes in London and the Midlands resulted in outrage and raised tensions in our communities, which in turn, of course, has led to extra policing to provide protection and security and also to police political protests. But I believe also they have shown some of the successes of our policies designed to increase integration and inter-community understanding and cohesion. So, for example, the murder of Mr. Rigby was roundly and loudly condemned by a very wide range of Muslim leaders, in a manner, sadly, we might not have expected just a few years ago. You will, of course, note that these trends, these simpler, less sophisticated crimes by self-organised or lone actors of whatever motivation, are by definition in some ways harder to detect or to tackle through some of our intelligence techniques. In the UK, we clearly have to depend more on families, school friends, health professionals, employers, people observing changes in behaviour and having the confidence to come forward. We do have frequent examples of this, but we also have many examples of warning signs being missed, ignored, or not brought to the attention of the authorities. And I suspect that we do not have quite the levels of alertness that you have fostered in Israel, although we do have a lot of good citizens who report suspicious items and behaviours. Ultimately, I am one of those who does believe that within the UK, it will be communities that defeat terrorism. It remains our greatest challenge to support the development of communities that are wholly hostile to violent extremism and to be able to identify, support, and protect those who are vulnerable to radicalisation. Meanwhile, my officers, dedicated, capable professionals, more skilled and better equipped than they have ever been, are working in an environment which is in some other ways also more challenging. We do have high levels of public confidence in our ability to tackle terrorism, and I believe we do have a very good record of using our considerable powers, and the UK does have some very strong legislation, using those powers sensitively and in a way that maintains confidence and encourages people to give us intelligence and evidence. Nevertheless, we are seeing some of our techniques degraded by the day, particularly in the sphere of communications data. And in the atmosphere of a very lively debate about where the balance between individual liberty and security should lie, some challenges to our powers and techniques. In particular, some increasing concerns about surveillance, about CCTV, about biometric and other personal data being retained. And of course, in law enforcement, we regard these as fundamental to our abilities to tackle terrorism, but we do absolutely recognise and respect the fact that ultimately the decision about where the line should be drawn between liberty and security, between privacy and safety, are not decisions for cops. We know where cops will always draw the line, quite far out here, but for the public and for our politicians. And our job is to use our powers judiciously and to explain our actions and our professional views when we are asked to do so and when it is appropriate. Secondly, our decisions are certainly being scrutinised more and more in Parliament, in the courts, in the media, to name but a few. Accountability is absolutely fundamental to good policing and indeed to our democracy. But a great multiplicity of confusing requests and scrutinies can be very sapping of morale and indeed of leadership time. A further challenge for us all is our ability to work effectively internationally. It's already been mentioned this morning several times. We have to be able to share and protect intelligence, to make decisions about jurisdiction and about assistance very quickly, to be able to follow money, people, illicit goods fast and effectively. Finally, our highly sensitive techniques, some of them used by our intelligence agencies and our international partners, are being, it seems almost daily, exposed by activists, journalists, spies, what we would once have called traitors, and on occasion by governments themselves. This conference comes at an extraordinary time for the intelligence communities, particularly in the US and the UK. But I said I wouldn't speak about intelligence. I am, thankfully, neither qualified nor authorized to do so. It also very obviously comes at an extraordinary time in the history of North Africa and the Middle East. As we watch the ghastly events in Syria unfolding, it's very hard to know for us in the UK, some way away, in our largely comfortable lives, with good security, a working democracy, a free press, in fact a very free press, and a largely functioning and uncorrupted and incorruptible criminal justice system, what on earth the effects of these extraordinary events in this part of the world will be. What is certain to us in the UK is that we will need our friends and trusted partners more than ever. Jonathan Evans, many of you will know, the recently retired Director General of the Security Service in the UK, said that people who are paid to think about the future from a security perspective always tend to conclude that future threats are more complex, more unpredictable, and more alarming. But at the end of a very distinguished career, he concluded that it's rarely the case. My personal view for the UK is that it is really quite a complex picture. Despite all our efforts, there is much we don't understand, and we cannot and should not pretend we can reduce the risks of terrorist attacks to zero. But we can and we must continue to learn, to avoid complacency, to, and I will use the word, fight terrorism with all our skills and power, and to do so with the same virtues which have over the years been shown in Israel, with endurance, with determination, and with courage. Thank you.